He also asked for anti-aircraft defense systems, reconstruction aid, more sanctions on Russia, and help in exporting Ukrainian grain. US officials say there will be a new package of sanctions aimed at increasing the pressure on the Kremlin. The Ukrainian MP, Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsadze, explains what her country wants to hear.
Urgency, quality and quantity of the weaponry that we need is becoming really critical. So I hope that there will be also a leadership step on behalf of the G7 to show that military support will be pouring into Ukraine.
The G7 leaders will also be discussing the international food security in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Olivier de Schutter is an expert on food sustainability systems. He says the conflict has exacerbated the global food crisis and that the summit will concentrate on short-term solutions for those countries most affected by hunger.
The G7 will focus on the short term, and the short term is to provide humanitarian support to countries so that they can meet their high food import bills. And the G7 will certainly say that we need to help these countries financially, bailing them out in order to allow them to import food at a reasonable price.
5 days after a deadly earthquake struck Afghanistan, some villages are still waiting to receive aid. More than 1,000 people are reported to have died in the tremor, which hit a mountainous region near the border with Pakistan. The King of the Netherlands, Willem-Alexander, and Queen Maxima are starting a 3-day visit to Austria. Starting in Vienna, they're being greeted with military honours by President Alexander van der Bellen. The weather, mostly sunny and very hot, with a lively to strong wind in the east and in the mountains. Thunderclouds and showers are developing in the west, bringing the risk of some heavy storms. Highs ranging mostly between 27 and 35 degrees. And now for the news in German with Arthur Treinacher.
Vielen Dank. Am zweiten Tag des G7-Gipfels im oberbayerischen Elmau ist am Vormittag Ukraines Präsident Zelensky per Video zugeschaltet worden. Dabei erhob er bekannte Forderungen wie ein Gasembargo gegen Russland, finanzielle Unterstützung für den Wiederaufbau seines Landes sowie verstärkte Waffenlieferungen. Wegen des russischen Angriffskrieges wollen die G7-Staaten nach Angaben der US-Regierung weitere Sanktionen gegen Moskau verhängen. Die Maßnahmen richteten sich demnach etwa gegen militärische Produktions- und Lieferketten. In Luxemburg beraten die Energieminister der EU über ausbleibende Gaslieferungen aus Russland. Es geht unter anderem darum, wie gemeinsam gespart werden kann. 12 EU-Länder bekommen kein Gas mehr aus Russland oder deutlich weniger, darunter Deutschland und Österreich. Beschlossen wurde, dass die Gasspeicher in den EU-Ländern bis zum Winter zu mindestens 80% aufgefüllt sein müssen. Energieministerin Gewessler hat mehr Tempo beim gemeinsamen Gaseinkauf gefordert. Österreich und andere EU-Länder haben zuvor eine Absichtserklärung unterzeichnet, im Krisenfall gegenseitig zu helfen. Bei der Bundespräsidentschaftswahl am 9. Oktober will auch der Chef der MFG-Partei antreten. Der Rechtsanwalt Markus Brunner ist Gründungsmitglied der impfkritischen MFG-Partei. Bei seiner Vorstellung sagt Brunner, er wolle es in eine Stichwahl gegen Van der Bellen schaffen. Als Bundespräsident würde er die gesamte Regierung sofort entlassen und die Aufhebung aller verbliebenen Corona-Maßnahmen erzwingen, so Brunner.
Und nun zu den Wetteraussichten natürlich, die hat jetzt noch Gerald Holziner für Sie.
Richtungsweisend für den weiteren Verlauf des Sommers soll der heutige Siebenschläfertag sein oder zumindest die Großwetterlage in den 1-2 Wochen danach. Demnach könnten uns sehr warme, aber insgesamt doch wechselhafte Sommermonate bevorstehen. Heute ist es jedenfalls fast überall in Österreich heiß. In den Landeshauptstädten hat es aktuell um 31 Grad, nur in Bregenz mit Wolken 23 Grad. Der Nachmittag bringt viel Sonne und meist 27 bis 35 Grad, dazu im Osten und im Bergland teils kräftigen, föhnigen Südwind. Dichtere Wolken halten sich vorläufig nur in Teilen von Vorarlberg, etwa im Bregenzer Wald. Von Westen her wird die Luft aber allmählich überall feuchter. In den Abendstunden bilden sich schon von Vorarlberg bis Oberösterreich Regenschauer und Gewitter mit Unwetterpotenzial, in der Nacht dann auch weiter im Osten. Weitgehend verschont bleibt diesmal nur der Süden Österreichs. Morgen Dienstag schwül, wechselhaft und von West nach Ost meist 23 bis 31 Grad.
Das war also das Mittagsjournal am Siebenschläfertag. Sabine Heiner Technik, Christine Zünige, Frankenberger Regie und alle anderen Beteiligten bedanken sich für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Bleiben Sie dran, es ist Punkt 1.
G7 officials say the choking off of the gold market will have a significant impact on Russia's ability to raise funds. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan will attend a round of talks with the leaders of Sweden and Finland, as well as NATO, ahead of the summit in Madrid. Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership, but the bids have faced opposition from Turkey, which has been angered by Helsinki and Stockholm's support for Kurdish militants and arms embargoes on Ankara. The Turkish presidential spokesman says Erdogan attending the talks doesn't mean the country would take a step back from its position. Thousands of demonstrators rallied in Madrid on Sunday to call for peace and to protest a NATO summit to be held there this week. Demonstrators said they believe an increase in defense spending in Europe urged by the US-led military alliance was a threat to peace, saying the spending should be given to schools and hospitals. South African police are investigating the death of at least 20 people at a nightclub in the coastal town of East London. Police officials said those found dead early Sunday were young adults aged between 18 and 20 years old. The police said the victims included 8 girls and 12 boys. It's unclear what led to the death, and autopsies are being carried out to determine the cause. NASA has launched a rocket from Australia for the first time in 27 years. The rocket took off from Arnhem Space Center in the Northern Territory early Monday morning after a delay for rain and wind. It marks the first time since 1995 that the U.S. Space Agency has launched a rocket from Australia, and its first ever launch from a commercial launch pad on foreign soil. NASA says the rocket traveled around 300 kilometers into space to conduct astrophysics studies only possible in the southern hemisphere. This is the first of 3 launches. The next one is scheduled for July the 4th. And that's the news. I'm Sui.
Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
G7 nations are set to put a price cap on Russian oil. As Hong Kong's next leader, Zhang Li, ready to take office on July 1st, we take a look at the future prospects of the city's development under his leadership. And protests erupt across the United States over U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overturn the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade abortion ruling. You're listening to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Liu Kun in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, download our podcast by searching World Today. The group of 7 leaders are discussing plans to cap the price of Russian oil at the group's annual meeting in Germany. The price cap scheme promoted by Washington is part of the discussions on how to pressure Russia over its special military operation in Ukraine without stoking global inflationary pressures. The Associated Press reports that details of how a price cap would work, as well as impact on the Russian economy, are to be resolved by the G7 finance ministers in the coming weeks and months. Meanwhile, the U.S., Japan, and Canada moved to ban imports of Russian gold on the first day of the G7 summit. Russian gold exports were worth $15.5 billion last year. Over the weekend, some 4,000 people marched in Munich, Germany, against the G7 summit. Some protester groups have accused the major Western countries of triggering the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, leading the whole world to bear the consequences, including food crisis. For more on this issue, as well as the ongoing G7 summit, we're now joined by Christine Lequin, Professor of European Politics at Sciences Po in Paris. Thank you, Professor, for joining us again.
Hello.
Now, Professor, hello indeed. Did this suggestion of a price cap come as a surprise to you, and why are G7 nations still working on limiting Russia's oil businesses after their previous efforts to phase out Russian oil in their countries?
I think we have to consider 2 different things. The sanctions against Russian oil business is a political sanctions which has to do with the military intervention of Russia in Ukraine, and which is a clear violation of international law. So this is a political reaction. The price cap is something different. It's not a surprise. It's linked to the fact that in the destabilization of the markets, right? It's important not to have an inflation of the prices, because if we have an inflation, then it will go against the economies of the whole world and also against the ordinary citizen. So if you cap the price, well, you avoid an unnecessary increase also of the price of energy, etc., for the industry and for the citizens.
But then, Professor, although we have been hearing from some of the leaders at the G7 summit that this cap will be serving, as part of the purpose is to stop the inflation around the world. But then, does this cap also mean that the previous efforts by Western countries to phase out Russian oil to hurt Russia economically has failed, Professor?
I don't think so. I think we have to distinguish against Russia and then the rest of the world, because oil is not produced only by Russia. It's produced by many other countries in the world, including the United States of America. And of course, if the West and Europe in particular is buying less oil to Russia, then we have also a temptation to buy another market, and the same for many other countries like Japan, etc. So trying to cap the price, of course, is a way not to increase too much artificially oil prices, with the consequences we can imagine for the economy of the world. So it's something which has a connection, of course, but which has to be distinguished. On one side, it's an economic measure. On the other side, sanctions is a hard politics measure, right?
Indeed, it is sending a lot of political signals, in fact. Well, British newspaper The Financial Times reports that under the proposed scheme, Europe would limit the availability of shipping and insurance businesses that would facilitate the flow of Russian oil. Now, Professor, how do you understand the scheme? How do you think it will pan out?
Well, it means that the companies who decided to transport and ship the Russian oil will have to face or cope with the indirect consequences of sanctions. And again, it has to do with politics, right? I know that many companies in the world are making business with Russian oil, and they will have an impact on them. But if you decide to have sanctions, it's precisely to have an impact, right? So this would have never happened if Russia didn't decide to invade militarily Ukraine. Again, it's a political reaction to this act of war, but with indirect consequences for shipping companies all around the world. I agree with that.
Well, I guess, Professor, to be fair, different people would, put the response or put the blame on both sides. I mean, both on Russia and on both sides, if we are coming to, the origin of the war that's happening in Ukraine. But Professor, if you say this is a very big part of it, this is political, then do you think it will be a big blow economically to Russia? Professor?
Yes, we are pretty now convinced. I mean, the experts that the packages of sanctions will have effect on the Russian economy, and especially it will have effect also on the middle class of Russia, right? People who were used to travel abroad, who cannot anymore, go abroad, use their credit cards, etc. And if you take the structure of the Russian economy, it was mainly based on gas exports, and oil exports. So of course it will have an impact. But I do not agree when we said that the responsibility of the war is shared, because so far as I know, it's a military invasion of a country, Russia, to the soil of an independent country called Ukraine. So it's and we have laws according to the international law, which said that the frontiers cannot be violated. So unfortunately, I think the responsibility is more in the camp of Russia than Ukraine.
Well, Professor, I am not. I don't think the analysis or the stakeholders in this war are only Russia and Ukraine. There are many players. For example, the European Union, NATO, the United States. And if we take a look at the responses of the war from worldwide, for example, a lot of countries in Asia are not joining Western sanctions against Russia. So maybe that said something. But again, Professor, I respect your opinion, and I think this will be a topic for another hour of discussion. So back to our discussion on the G7 summit. How do you think Russia will respond to this cap? Does Russia have a lot of tools at its disposal, to react?
Well, possibility, of course, is because it's no legal implication what the G7 is asking, right? It's just a political demand.
But Russia, Professor, sorry to interrupt, but I guess Russia can retaliate, right, in some kind of form. For example, cut oil exports, right? Would that be a blow to world economy?
I think so. It will be, but Russia has probably the possibility to find some alternative markets. But maybe even in the alternative markets, the countries will ask for a certain limit of the prices, okay, because it's in their interest, right? So it will be at the end a loss of money, a loss of receipt for Russia, definitely, and this is very sad because
I guess
it's a Russian society. It's a Russian society which will have the effect of that, which will have to cope with the effect of that, right?
Well,
and if the war didn't take place, this would have never happened.
Well, I guess when it comes to the impact, it will be global and not only be on the Russian people. But Professor, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson reiterated at the meeting that the need to maintain consensus and warned about fatigue among politicians and the public. Now, Professor, how do you distinguish the different national interests of these G7 countries in the Ukraine crisis? I mean, they are not necessarily totally aligned with each other, right?
Well, I think on principle they are aligned. So they're all condemning the military intervention and consider that this is not acceptable and that something has to be done. So if you take Japan, if you take the European countries, if you take United States and Canada, they all agree, for instance, on having sanctions. But where you have nuances is the way you are now dealing with Russia to, make sure that we have a sort of a peace process one day. I think for some countries, especially for some European countries like France and Germany, it's very important not to shut the door of negotiation with Vladimir Putin.
Well,
for some others, like Mr. Johnson, it's less obvious. He's much more on the tough line. And is not so interested in the negotiation with Mr. Putin. You see. So this is the nuance between the different members of the G7.
Well, it's a lot more complex and, sophisticated than, what we can cover in 10 minutes. But thank you, Professor. We appreciate your time and also your analysis. That was Christine Lequin, Professor of European Politics at Sciences Po in Paris. Well, at the G7 summit, the G7 leaders have detailed a plan to mobilize $600 billion in funding for the developing world in a move to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is relaunching a scheme unveiled at the summit last year. Earlier projects of the plan include a solar power project in Angola, a vaccine manufacturing facility in Senegal, and a submarine telecoms cable connecting Singapore to France via Africa. My colleague Ding Heng earlier had a talk with Wang Yiwei, Zhang Menai, Chair Professor at the School of International Relations, Renmin University of China. Let's take a listen.
Is this a sign that there is consensus within the G7 that there is an urgent need to do something to counter the Belt and Road Initiative?
Probably yes, because the Belt Road Initiative is so successful. It covered 150 countries and more than 30 international organizations, including the United Nations. So it's so influential. Majority of the UN members joined. So the West that dominates the world is declining the very urgent need to counter so-called China-led, not just BRI, maybe China-led international order. In the U.S. words, only 5 to 10 years otherwise the West-centric world will totally give up to the China-led one. So that's the urgent need. Another one is the urgent need for the world. We need to invest infrastructure, a real economy, not to make a bubble anymore. The traditional globalization, so-called new liberalization globalization, is over. So now everybody focus on the digitalization, focus on the public health, focus on the new energy, focus on the mutual connectivity. So that's two means of urgent needs.
Okay, so regarding the specific funding of this particular plan, the United States will aim to leverage a total of $200 billion over the coming 5 years through a combination of federal and a private sector investments. The European Union, as we understand, has already announced some 300 billion euros as part of its Global Gateway program announced sometime last year. Do you think this money will be in place in time?
Always a question mark. For the Europeans to not suffer so many crises, the Ukraine crisis make the inflation and the food crisis, even social crisis arising. So for the transformation to digital, to deal with climate change, for the low carbon energy, everything needs money. But where the money comes from? The Ukraine crisis also make the Europeans contribute more on the military budget. So how can they have money to invest in infrastructure, even abroad, not just domestic? So private companies focus on the short profits, not long-term infrastructure building. So that's the key. U.S. they want to let the new globalization on the digital infrastructure. In the name of the Building Back Better world, now use the global infrastructure to redesign the new globalization. We, the U.S., continue to dominate. The traditional one, let China be the world factory and the world market.
Now, when this plan was unveiled last year during the G7 summit in Britain last year, it was initially known as Build Back Better World. Now it has been renamed and relaunched. What do you think this tells us about?
Actually, it's very simple that the U.S. any initiative The domestic constraint is the key.
Okay.
Not just because the U.S. domestic policy is very divided, but also very weak Biden government. Now, after the midterm election, Biden will be lame duck and cannot be re-elected, and then all this so-called initiative, including the Indo-Pacific strategy, will be changed. The domestic constraint for other members of the G7 also very clear. The very divided, for instance, Macron re-elected as the French president, but actually the parliament elections also they cannot have the majority of the votes and the seats, and also big challenges.
Okay. So Mr. Biden says when democracies do all that they can offer, they would triumph over autocracies, telling democracy are offering better options for people across the world. Also, we understand European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has said during the summit that the aim is to present a positive, powerful investment impulse to the world to show our partners in the developing countries that they have a choice. So, I mean, when we talk about, say, making investment in building infrastructure in a particular less developed country, do we have to distinguish between democracy versus non-democracy, democracy versus authoritarianism? Do you think this kind of idea or concepts matter?
No, actually, the economic globalization, they have the principles, standard, and the rules. So you cannot play the political card to change that kind of road against that kind of principles. Otherwise, you make continue making further mistakes. China actually welcome any investment in infrastructure because the gap is huge. China also always ready to compete with any kind of initiative. Thirdly, China also always highlights the principles of the synergies of the strategies. The world needs to be mutually connected. The world needs more investment in your infrastructure. Even for the advanced economy themselves need to update their infrastructure, digitalize their infrastructure, mutually connected to each other.
So from talking more about what you have elaborated, Professor Wang, because you said that China actually welcomes the sort of Western-led initiatives. So from China's perspective, when we're facing a scenario in which Western countries or G7 economies are increasingly rolling out plans or initiatives or projects hoping to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, how should China respond? Or how should Beijing respond?
China is very confident about its comparative advantage in building the infrastructure for three reasons. First, China has most of the complete and comprehensive categories of industries. According to the UN framework, China has everything actually, can build from the silk to satellite. So it's the most efficient in building infrastructure and the costs lowest. Secondly, China has a strong state enterprises which can focus on the long-term profit, not just the short-term of the private companies that focus the very short-term. Thirdly, actually, China is not just focused on the infrastructure. We also focus on the cluster of the industries. So the Western model, particularly the U.S. model, is like the government should serve for the market. But in China, not just the government serves for the market, but also government create market. For instance, we built a high-speed railway connect Beijing and Tianjin. But not just sells the tickets to return the profits, but the tourists or other industries along the high-speed railway boomed. So the government also created market. So that's the reason China has now more than 40,000 kilometers of high-speed railway, making China mutually connected, a big single market. And the Chinese economy can have a long-term high standard of the primary forces. So that kind of approach and model, which U.S. not have for other advanced economy also, China, before open reform, China's per capita GDP is only 1/3 of the South Sahara African countries. But after 40 years open reform, the people said if you want to get rich, build the infrastructure. If you want to get rich quickly, build the motor road. If you want to get rich immediately, build the internet road. So that kind of model is very successful and very attractive to other developing countries, not the US model. Because they are industrial, actually very old now, 200 years ago, 100 years ago. The private capitals and multi-party systems cannot focus on long term. So that's self-connect from China.
And finally, very briefly, Professor Wang, I remember a few years ago, China and some particular countries in the West, for example, France, Italy, Germany, were still seeking opportunities to cooperate in building infrastructure networks in third markets in the developing world, for example, in Africa. Now, do you think there is still such room for such kind of cooperation?
Of course, always be the room and huge potential. But the problem is, firstly, the U.S., the West, use the safety and not just security as an excuse. Any infrastructure, any investment from China, they claim this is the security problem or safety problem like the Huawei. Secondly, China, so-called China model, they're very afraid. China promoted the China model abroad. Actually, it's not the case. So the Americans play the card of the ideology, so the value-based, so the rules-based international order, human rights, everything in their kind of standard. And the U.S. has a very aggressive initiative like the Indo-Pacific, target China. In Europe, it's targeting Russia, and even people can decouple. So that's make this cooperation actually more difficult.
That was Wang Yiwei with Renmin University of China. You're listening to World Today. Stay with us.
Hello, this is Michael Zhang. Greetings from Los Angeles of the Golden State of California. Thank you today for making me part of your team. I truly enjoyed the debates we had and look forward to many more in the years to come.
As Secretary of the Embassy of Chile to China, it's been an honor taking part on your show and telling you about the relationship between Chile and China. Wishing you all the best.
In-depth analysis, valuable insights, expert views, presented by an award-winning team. Today, keeping you well-informed, up-to-date, and ahead of the news.
You're listening to World Today. I'm Liu Kun in Beijing. Hong Kong's chief executive-elect Zhang Li will begin his 5-year term this Friday when the city celebrates the 25th anniversary of his return to the motherland on July 1st. Mr. Li is a very pragmatic, hardworking, and highly disciplined leader. And thanks to the last government and assistance from the Chinese mainland, as well as a reformed legislature which functions properly, Mr. Li will start leading the city's new government with strong foundations. And that's what Professor Richard Cullen, visiting professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong, told my colleague Xu Yawen in an interview following Zhang Li's election as the next leader of Hong Kong in May. Let's take a listen at the full interview.
Professor Cullen, we know Zhang Li was formerly Hong Kong's chief secretary, but for those who may not know much about him, could you tell us more about the incoming chief executive and also his administrative plan?
Sure. I have had no personal contact with John Lee, so my understanding of him is based on what I see and what I have read. I think he's intelligent, thoughtful, very committed to Hong Kong, pragmatic, and a number of people have noted what I think is a very important quality, that he is a good listener. He's very hardworking, he's obviously highly disciplined, and I think based on past performance you can see he knows how to set priorities and then stick with them, even when things are difficult. Let me just say a couple of things at the outset which are not directly related to him personally, but I think it's important to note that the foundations on which this government will be created are now quite strong, and that's really as a result of the current government having endured some very, very challenging and difficult times. So the current government, led by Carrie Lam, had to deal with manifestly dysfunctional legislature for most of the period that she was in government, but particularly from the middle of 2019. Then they had the insurrection, which lasted for 7 months or more, which was highly destructive and very violent. And as that came to an end, the COVID-19 pandemic came, and by and large Hong Kong has dealt with that well, although the fifth wave has been difficult, but it's back under control. And we've now got, thanks to the last government and assistance from Beijing, a reformed legislature which is actually working properly as a legislature. So all of those things are going to be significant help to John Lee as he starts leading this new government. And the other point I would make, which people do often overlook, the fiscal foundations in Hong Kong, that is the money which the government has saved up, remain exceptionally strong, much stronger than in any Western jurisdiction. Just to give you an idea, despite spending a lot of money to try and help the economic problems during the COVID crisis pandemic, Hong Kong still has enough money saved up to run the government for about 1 year and a half without raising a single cent in taxation. So it's in a very good position. There are many, many problems John Lee faces, but the foundations are good.
Mm-hmm. That's about good news, right?
Yeah.
The May 8th chief executive election was the first one since the improvement of Hong Kong's electoral system. Then how has the election process been different from the past? What has been changed?
Okay, well look, in fact, the electoral system used to elect John Lee in many respects is very similar to the system we've had since 1997. That is, an electoral college which is elected or selected from various sectors in society, but the current one has about 1,500 members, elects the chief executive. So there's not a general election where all of the people vote. We looked like having a major change introduced in 2015 when a proposal was made for electing the chief executive by universal suffrage. But the candidates would have to be nominated by a nomination committee, so they would be checked and vetted. The pan-democrat opposition refused to accept this reform and vetoed it in the legislature. Had they not done that, we would have been having a competitive election at the moment, subject to universal suffrage, and we would have had one in 2017. So what we're doing at the moment is really using the election system, a version of the election system, which was introduced in 1997.
Professor Collin, I spoke to a scholar of Hong Kong issues who told me that patriots administering Hong Kong is the soul of the new electoral system that will safeguard the implementation of one country and two systems principle. I want to hear what do you make of this. How do you perceive the necessity to have patriots managing the city?
Okay, look, I do have an answer, and it's based on my experience in watching the way the electoral process operates in other Western jurisdictions. And in all of these jurisdictions, especially ones created by the British as they established their empire, you have a concept called the loyal opposition. So this is usually the primary political party which is not in government, so it's constantly arguing with the government. But it is expected always, no matter what happens, to support the constitutional order and to support social order. In other words, they support the basic structure under which the jurisdiction operates. Now, what happened, unfortunately, in Hong Kong is the opposition became increasingly disloyal, and they rendered the legislature almost completely dysfunctional at times. Plus, they were going off overseas and lobbying the US government, for example, to launch all sorts of very savage attacks against the Hong Kong government in terms of sanctions and so on. So the problem is they had lost, in my view, any serious understanding of what it means to be a loyal opposition. When I look at the stipulation that patriots should administer Hong Kong, this to me is a measure to ensure that what happened over the last few years cannot happen again. It's another way of guaranteeing, but in a more stipulated form, that any opposition, any criticism of the government is going to be loyal. That is, people who are critical will remain committed to the constitutional order. That's what fell apart in 2019, I'm afraid. And so I see it as a kind of a more positive statement to create a situation where everybody involved in government must be completely committed to maintaining the constitutional order and social order in the jurisdiction, in this case, in the SAR.
That's a very good point. And then, Professor, I want to ask you that given Zhang Li's result-oriented traits, what changes should we expect to see under his leadership, especially when the city is facing a complex international environment and greater regional competition?
Okay, yeah, well, look, I think that the prospects, despite the external difficulties, I think the prospects are still really very positive. This much I would say, certainly, the prospects in this part of the world, that is, East Asia and especially China, are better than anywhere else in the world currently, and that's good for Hong Kong. So I think the new government led by John Lee will be very focused on primarily looking after issues in Hong Kong and doing whatever is needed in order to manage these external circumstances. But as I mentioned before, the foundations in place are good. There's no mystery about the issues that need to be dealt with, the sort of livelihood issues. I said in a recent article that I wrote that it looks like for the new government the three most important issues are housing, housing and housing. This is a really fundamental problem in Hong Kong. The public housing system is terrific and it does a great job for those who are actually in public housing. But there's several 100,000 people who are badly housed or terribly housed, and this problem needs to be dealt with, and I think there's a very strong commitment to deal with that, and also to look at problems associated with aged care, made clear from the COVID pandemic, healthcare, education, career prospects, the environment, and so on. So I think there'll be a lot of focus on that. I think the other thing, partly to repeat something that I've said, is, there would be no Hong Kong without China. And China is still the most dynamically successful economic region in the world. And it is set, despite all of the difficulties, it is set, I think, to become, in straight GDP terms, the largest economy in the world within the next 20 years and probably sooner. This is good for Hong Kong. Hong Kong is in the right place at a difficult time, but it's the right time. And so I'm hopeful that when you look at that external or that regional environment and the good foundations and hopefully a successful governing team, that the next 5 years will be better than the last 5 years have been.
That was Professor Richard Cullen, visiting professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong, talking to my colleague Xi Yawen over the prospect of Hong Kong's development as the incoming chief executive of the city, Zhang Li, ready to take office later this week. You're listening to World Today. I'm Liu Kun. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overturn the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade abortion ruling has met violent protests. The decision allows individual states to enact abortion laws that can be as restrictive as they wish. A recent NPR-PBS NewsHour Marist poll shows that by a 56% to 40% margin, respondents oppose the court's decision, including 45% who strongly oppose it. NPR reports that the poll surveyed 941 respondents and was conducted Friday through Saturday after the decision. For more on this issue, we're now joined by Harvey Zodin, Senior Fellow with Center for China and Globalization. He's also former Vice President of ABC TV Network. Harvey, thanks for talking to us again.
My pleasure.
Now, Harvey, for our listeners, first, could you please briefly walk us through the process of the 1973 ruling?
Yeah, it's a little complicated, but I'll try my best. In Roe versus Wade, by a 7-2 majority, the Supreme Court ruled that overly restrictive state regulations of abortion was unconstitutional. And the court held that Texas laws criminalizing abortion at that time, in most cases, violated constitutional rights of privacy of women. And it found those rights implicit in the guarantees of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And they went on to have a balancing test between the compelling state interest and the rights of women to have abortion. And they drew the line basically at the first trimester of pregnancy, that women had this right, but the state interest after that time was more compelling. And what the recent ruling did was say that states have the right to decide this, and they could make any rule that they wanted from conception onward.
Now, on this new ruling, Harvey, help us understand in practical terms what this will mean for American women.
It'll mean different things for different women.
In different states, as I understand.
In different states and in different socioeconomic circumstances. It really means that women and their families most affected, many of them who are poor, single parents, people holding low-wage jobs, are going to be foreclosed from getting abortions in 22 states. And they're not able to afford the money or time off to travel to other states. The ruling means that many of them must get dangerous back alley abortions using coat hangers and other methods that are really draconian. The risk, though, isn't only to women involved, but to the American system of government, the American experiment, now basically controlled by big money interests who'd like to turn back the clock to the 18th and 19th century, when blacks were slaves, when women couldn't vote or have property, and there was no right to contraception, no right to abortion or same-sex marriage or even interracial marriage. So the ruling, along with last week's cases extending gun rights and further destroying separation of church and state, is just the most recent proof that the American system is broken. And unless voters remove their enablers in Congress in November, all hope is going to be lost. And I'm not optimistic.
Well, Harvey, American public confidence over the government has indeed dropped over the past few years, according to different polls. But that drop was usually related to either the executive branch or Congress. Then, now, in what way do you think the new ruling will impact the confidence among American public over the Supreme Court?
Oh, I think it's going to make it more negative because the Supreme Court is an unelected branch of government. And as you pointed out in those statistics from the polls, a majority of Americans oppose banning abortions. And it's really going to further erode confidence in the U.S. system, but especially in the unelected Supreme Court who serve for life, never face voters, and they can lie at their confirmation hearings as the last three Republicans have done. Yeah, so no wonder another poll statistic, an October 2021 Grinnell College poll, found that 62% of respondents actually believe that the Supreme Court decisions are driven by politics rather than by the U.S. Constitution and the law. And I think that since that time, less than a year ago, the percentage must have dramatically increased in the last few days.
Indeed, as the protests show, that America is moving further into a very polarized society. Thank you, Harvey, for talking to us. That was Harvey Zodin, Senior Fellow with Center for China and Globalization, and also former Vice President of the ABC TV network. You're listening to World Today. Stay with us.
As a guest speaker with today, I feel very much grateful for providing a chance for me to communicate to the world in China's progress and China's accomplishment, and also China's rich cultural heritage, and of course China's desire to integrate itself into the international community. I believe today opens a window as well as builds a bridge between people in China and the world.
You're listening to World Today. I'm Liu Kun. China's industrial firms saw their profits increase by 1% in the first 5 months of this year, driven by the gradual recovery of logistics and supply chains. Sales at industrial enterprises improved in May. The National Bureau of Statistics said industrial profit in May dropped 6.5% from a year earlier, compared with an 8.5% decline in April. It added that the government's moves to support growth helped reduce industrial companies' operating costs. For more on this and the broader economy, my colleague